Hi there, everyone. It is Kelly Moran, and I wanted to do a screencast for us on a presentation specific to the simple view of reading. So, in our on-demand professional development series, if you will, related to the topic of science of reading, one of the things that we've pointed out is that to understand this umbrella or this topic of the science of reading, we need to look closely at the simple view of reading and what that entails to help piece together all the different frameworks of that umbrella of science of reading. So, if you are not already familiar, the simple view of reading is simply a formula. It's a widely supported view in reading research that reading has two different components. And that's it. That's why it's called a simple view, that reading has two different components: word recognition, which we refer to as decoding, and language comprehension. Now, most of us as educators, and those of us who are specifically educators of teaching of reading, we know that the component of word recognition entails a lot of different skills. We also know that language comprehension is very complex and includes several different layers there. So, even though this is called the simple view of reading because of the two components and fitting into a formula, we know that as we kind of deconstruct each one of those components, that there are many different aspects to each one of those. So the simple view of reading is a formula. I chose to include images in this presentation that I lifted directly from Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement. Many of you have heard me talk before about Ohio's literacy plan. The first plan came out in January of 2018. You can see over here, this image, this is what the cover looked like. The plan was updated and re-released in January 2020. And if you want the slides to this presentation, I can of course give it to you. And the new plan is hyperlinked in here so that you can see how the plan has changed in the past 2 years. The new plan was rewritten to be directly aligned to the science of reading. And in the 50-page plan, it goes into detail about the simple view of reading and how Ohio should be using this model as our framework and as our kind of platform to teach reading to students. This is what we should be focused on as educators. So if you do a Google image search for simple view of reading, you'll find all different kinds of formulas. They all look very similar, of course, and they all include the same components. But for the purpose of our slideshow here, I wanted to take images directly from our plan in Ohio. So looking at our formula, again, we have the two parts: decoding, which is word level reading. This is the ability to transform print into spoken language. Language comprehension is the second component, and that's the ability to understand spoken language. When you multiply those two things together, you end up with reading comprehension. This view, this model was created by Goff and Tunmer in 1986. And if you really start to dig through and look up different peer-reviewed journals related to reading, their work and this view of the simple view of reading comes up in all of these different research articles related to the science of reading. Okay, so what's important to know about this formula is that it's not an addition formula, it is a multiplication formula. So that means if one of the components is a zero, if a child has no ability to decode but has strong language comprehension, then they're still not going to have fully developed reading comprehension. Vice versa, if a child is able to decode words, knows that code, that orthographic mapping of letter to sound, sound to letter, can sound out and decipher words, but yet has no background information or comprehension of language and vocabulary, again, the reading comprehension is not going to be comprehensive or full. So the simple view formula shows that a student's reading comprehension score can be predicted if decoding skills and language comprehension abilities are known. Notice again that decoding and language comprehension are not added together to predict the reading comprehension, they're multiplied. So when we're looking at the formula, the values of decoding and language comprehension must be between 0 and 1, or we would say 0% or 100%. A score of 0 means no skill or ability at all, and a score of 1 would indicate perfection. It's a formula with 3 variables, of course. So if you have 2 of the variables, the third then could be estimated using the formula. This image again was taken from Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement. So the ultimate goal for our readers is always going to be strong reading comprehension, right? This can't occur unless both decoding and language comprehension are strong. We need both elements of the formula to get to that end goal or that product of strong reading comprehension. We as teachers then must teach students to decode expertly as early as possible so that they can then devote the cognitive load to building the language comprehension piece, ultimately ending up with strong comprehension. We must provide students with strong content knowledge as well in as many domains as possible at all grade levels to develop that adequate language comprehension piece. So that's why we need to focus so strongly on decoding and phonics, whereas at the same time as students are building that part of the equation, we need to be providing them with experiences that will help them develop their content knowledge in different domains so that they can piece the two elements together and end up as successful comprehenders. So how did the simple view of reading originate? Well, Goff and Tunmer proposed it to clarify the role of decoding in reading. Many educators did, and some still do believe that strong decoding skills are not necessary to achieve reading comprehension if a reader's language abilities are strong. So beginning and struggling readers are often taught to compensate for weak decoding by guessing at unfamiliar words and text based on the first letter or the picture. Oftentimes, adults will say, look at the first letter, use that as a prompt to guess what the rest of the word is, or take a look at the picture. Those are not strategies we should use that are aligned to the simple view of reading and the science of reading, because it does not help foster that decoding piece. In contrast, when decoding is the focus of instruction, students are taught to sound out unfamiliar words using all the letters and to practice reading accurately until an adequate reading rate is achieved, along with accurate decoding. So again, when you hear people talk about the reading wars, this was this idea of do we really need daily systematic explicit phonics instructions? Some people believed that if you immersed kids with rich print literature sources and books that were highly engaging to them, that they would eventually just be able to develop this understanding of word knowledge on their own. But what Goff and Tunmer and several researchers have found is that it is so important to have explicit decoding taught to students, because that is an element needed if we want to end up with reading comprehension. Okay, so if we take a look more closely at the two different parts of the simple view of reading, we said that first part was decoding. Decoding, however, is a big topic. There's a lot of skills that fall within that branch. So when we take a look at decoding, we're talking about the skills of decoding, having students having an understanding of print concepts, phonological awareness, phonics and word recognition, and word knowledge. The definition goes far beyond just the traditional of decoding as the ability to sound out words based on phonics rules. The meaning of decoding expands to include fast and accurate reading of familiar and unfamiliar words in both lists and connected texts. So when we're talking about decoding and we're talking about understanding print concepts, phonological awareness, the ability to hear sounds, manipulate sounds, understand word patterns and spelling patterns, all of these things blend together and start to weave together so that students become fluent readers. Now, just because they're a fluent reader doesn't mean they have the reading comprehension just yet, but it does mean that they're able to construct fluently a text, get through each word, say it out loud, and know what the words are. Meaning is something separate, and we'll look at that next. But I want you to know that these different elements fall under the topic of decoding, and when working together can help students read fluently. Language comprehension is the second part of the formula, and look at all of the different elements that fit into that category. So when we're talking about language comprehension, we're talking about all of these things here: background knowledge, academic language skills, academic vocabulary, inferential language skills, and narrative language skills. This again, this image was lifted right from Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement. So again, we're using their infographic images and models to lead our work and lead our understanding in our state. So language comprehension is defined as the ability to derive meaning from spoken words when they are part of sentences or other discourse. Language comprehension abilities at a minimum encompass receptive vocabulary, grammatical understanding, and discourse comprehension. Reading comprehension is different from language comprehension because of the reliance on print as opposed to oral language to perceive the words and derive meaning. So in other words, language comprehension becomes reading comprehension when word meaning is derived from print. It is possible to have strong language comprehension, still be a poor reader though, if the decoding piece is difficult for a reader. So let's kind of stop for a second and take a look again at what is the difference between the two skills we're talking about here. We're talking about decoding on the one end and comprehension on the other. These definitions came from Alan Comhe. He's written over 10 books, I believe. His bio is linked here. He's a current professor and reading researcher and has done a lot of work with the simple view of reading specifically. So I went to him for these exact definitions, but he talks about how decoding is a teachable skill. This is something that we can teach because it involves a narrow scope of knowledge, letter sounds and words and processes that once acquired will lead to fast, accurate word recognition. So we know through explicit or direct instruction, we can teach kids the skill of sounding out a word, learning 6 different syllable types, orthographic mapping, sound to letter, letter to sound, spelling word patterns, those types of skills. We can teach that, we can model that, we can practice that. Now, comprehension is not a skill and it is not easily taught. Comprehension is not like tying your shoe. Once you've learned the steps, you can master that and replicate it day after day after day. Comprehension is not a skill that you can replicate, be taught at one time and replicate it, because each time you read something new on a different topic, the skill is not relatable because you're developing or layering on new information. So comprehension is a complex of higher level mental processes. It includes thinking, reasoning, imagining, and interpreting. And you can't think, reason, imagine, or interpret about things you know nothing about if you don't have that background knowledge. The processes are dependent on having specific knowledge and content area, and this makes it largely knowledge based, not skills based. So here's where you've started to hear people, reading experts more recently, talk about the importance of building content knowledge, and moving away from what's become popular as skills-based comprehension teaching. When you look at several popular reading programs out there, or reading methods, or even reading activities for sale on Teachers Pay Teachers, or reading activities that you can find on Pinterest, a lot of them equate comprehension to skills based. And so what you'll see is week after week, we're going to introduce a new story. We're going to study this story, and I'm going to teach you these skills of comprehension, quote unquote, so to speak, of author's purpose, main idea and detail, sequencing, making inferences. Unfortunately, these quote unquote skills don't help to build student comprehension. Teaching kids to identify the main idea of the story of the week, related to ducks swimming at the pond, is not going to help them be a better comprehender at next week's story on baseball. Teaching kids how to identify the author's purpose of the story of how to make furniture is not going to help them next week if the story is on what the author's purpose is, on a fiction story about two friends playing with stuffed animals. It's not a transferable skill. It is more of a complex process of thinking, reasoning, imaging, and interpreting things that you know about or understand or have facts about. So doing this helps a student recycle information that they already have background knowledge for, but they don't become better comprehenders of new material. Oftentimes when you study the simple view of reading, or you hear someone talk about the simple view of reading, or you're reading something related to the simple view of reading, you will often find a connection to Scarborough's reading rope, or someone also talk about Scarborough's reading rope. The two are often paired together, and here's why. The simple view of reading was created first. Scarborough's reading rope came out much later, 2001, by Hollis Scarborough, excuse me. And what this image shows is all of those elements or skills or descriptors of those two main elements of word recognition and language comprehension, and how those many different elements fall under that umbrella or that component. And when they start to weave together and stick together and interlace together in readers' minds, that's how the two kind of come together to this joint, tightly knit rope with the ultimate goal of reading comprehension. So I wanted to include it in this presentation because I want you to be aware that the two images or the two ideas are often go together. The simple view of reading is a simple multiplication equation with our three variables. But as I mentioned earlier, we as educators know that when we talk about each one of those variables, there's many different layers or many different strands of rope, if you will, that make that up. So this image, again, now in the simple view of reading equation, we often see word recognition first. I just want to point out that that one's down here at the bottom. And again, that includes phonological awareness, decoding, spelling, sight recognition. And as we talked about earlier, those things blend together or weave or braid together, helping students become increasingly automatic or fluent readers. The language comprehension piece is up here, and that again includes things like background knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, language structures, verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge. When all of those things weave together, children become increasingly strategic in their understanding of concepts, facts, information, content. Those two parts of the rope start to braid together. That's where we end up with the skilled reading, fluent execution, and coordination of word recognition and text comprehension. Okay. For those of you who like to learn through video and watching on YouTube, I know there's so many great things on YouTube. I've linked in here. It's a short video. I believe it's about 10 minutes long that is specific to the simple view of reading and Scarborough's rope. So if you want to check that out, that is in here. So to recap, the simple view of reading shows us that reading comprehension results from skills and knowledge that can be broken into two distinct and identifiable categories: decoding and language comprehension. That's our big takeaway in understanding the simple view of reading. As reading teachers and as teachers of any subject area, we of course want to take note of when our students have deficiencies so that we can be strategic in getting them the help that they need. A deficit in reading can be placed into one of three categories, and this is very specifically addressed in Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement. So a reading deficit in decoding would be related to the student's ability to read the printed words accurately and rapidly. Deficits in language comprehension, however, are not specific to reading, but are related to a knowledge domain or to a higher order thinking skill, such as reasoning, imaging, or interpreting that we talked about earlier. Again, those knowledge, that's content, that's understanding facts. So the ultimate goal is strong reading comprehension, of course, and the simple view demonstrates that reading difficulties fall into three basic different types listed here before you. The first would be poor language comprehension. So this would be a student who has adequate decoding skills but has the weak language comprehension. Or a student could be poor at decoding. So they have the language comprehension, but they're weak at decoding. The extreme example of this would be a dyslexic student, or a reader could have a weakness in both areas, sometimes referred to as the garden variety poor reader. So we have to treat the deficits differently. When you say a student isn't comprehending, as a teacher, we have to ask ourselves, why are they not comprehending? Is it because they have a deficit in language comprehension? Is it because they have a deficit in decoding, or is it because they have a deficit in both? Understanding the deficit area will help us better provide intervention, reteaching, additional instruction in the area that a child needs. There is a wonderful, wonderful video by Linda Farrell who talks about the three areas of reading deficiency related to the simple view of reading and how she, as an educator, treats those deficiencies with students. And in this video, it's 11 minutes long. She gives specific examples of a student who has a deficit with decoding and what she would do with that student. She talks about a student who has a deficit with language comprehension and how she finds that out and how she would address that. So I would definitely direct you to that video. Is phenomenal in explaining the three different deficiencies. And again, I might add, this video came from the Reading Rockets website, which is a great resource in and of itself. And again, note that Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement also talks about these 3 areas of deficiency and how we as educators in this state need to be using evidence-based instructional strategies, materials, and pedagogy to address those 3 deficits. So that's all I have on the simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope. The sources used to put this together are linked here. And if anybody would like the slide deck for this presentation, certainly send me an email and let me know. Thanks so much.